Good morning, everyone, and thank you very, very much for joining today's webinar, which is focusing on Bill 148, Ontario's new proposed labour laws. Today, our panel will be discussing what changes are being proposed, the impact it will have, and most importantly, how to prepare. As businesses in Ontario and organizations across the province joining us today, we know how important it is for you to anticipate the impacts on your organization and to thoughtfully plan and prepare for royal assent of the coming bill. My name is Alan Lambert. I'm a partner at M&P. I'll be co-hosting today's webinar as well as presenting later on in our agenda. A little bit of background. We're thrilled to be co-hosting today's webinar with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and M&P as your co-host, one of the largest national accounting and consulting firms across Canada. We are a Canadian company. We focus on accounting, tax, and in this case, consulting advice. National in scope and local across Ontario, we serve individuals in the public, private companies, and have been in business for over 60 years. Through the development of strong relationships with organizations like the Chamber of Commerce and our clients, we do our best to provide personalized strategies from a local perspective. Underlining the importance of our time together today and this topic, which is important to all businesses, individuals across Ontario. Joining us today from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, we're pleased to have Carl Baldauf, who's the Vice President of Policy and Government Relations, as well a colleague of mine, Johan Tony, who's also a partner at M&P. As the webinar will proceed, we will each have an opportunity to provide you with important perspectives on current state and what we anticipate the future impacts will be of the bill. And at the end, we will leave time to have questions from the panel. And I think all of you have an opportunity to provide questions through the webinar portal. We've already had a few come in, which is great. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent to all those of you who thankfully have participated after the session. I'm now pleased to hand over the agenda and the next 20 minutes or so to Carl Baldauf from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I just want to begin by thanking M&P. You know, the Chamber of Commerce and the work that we do depends upon partnerships. And we went to M&P a few months ago. A member of our board, Murad Barani, is from M&P, and said to them, look, a lot of our members are very concerned about the impending changes from Bill 148. And we are looking to provide them with some educational resources to help them understand, our members understand how to transition. And M&P agreed to do this without cost. And so we owe a great debt of gratitude and thanks to them. I was in Smiths Falls last night talking about this product and talking about a presentation similar to the one that I'll give today. I was in Cambridge on Monday, and indeed 40 communities across the province in the last few months. And I think there's a broad appreciation of the work that partners like M&P have done to prepare us for this significant change. So I'm going to spend some time today talking about the legislation and talking about what we have done to assess the scale of change. But then I'm going to leave it to our friends at M&P to talk about how you can begin to think creatively about how to prepare for that change. And I might add, you know, I think the best advice is that this should be seen as a start, but you should take it upon yourself to consult management consultant, a lawyer, an HR consultant, accountants. Begin to understand how you can best prepare your business for the significant change that is ahead. So I'm going to start by talking about where the legislation is at. Today is actually the final day of standing committee hearings on the second reading of Bill 148. I'll actually be appearing at Queen's Park at 4 p.m. this afternoon to speak to the legislation. But following today's deliberations, there will be likely some changes that come, some amendments to the bill. And then following break week at Queen's Park next week, the bill will come back for third reading, and we presume royal assent certainly before the legislature retires for the winter session, at the end of this fall session, on December 13th. So we're likely a few weeks away from this legislation being fully passed. In our advocacy on the legislation, something that we keep in mind is the need to bring about an evidence-based conversation, because certainly we've heard voices from our membership that are very concerned with what these changes will mean for them. The truth is, as we look at the legislation, some components will come into effect immediately on passage of the bill. Some will come into effect on January 1st. Others will come into effect throughout 2018, and some as late as 2019, including scheduling and the final reform to the minimum wage change. And so, in driving an evidence-based conversation, we know that what we're doing is empowering, if not this government, then a future government to either press pause or reverse some of those changes that we feel will negatively impact economic development in this province. And so we are conducting aggressive government relations with not only this government, but also opposition parties, because we are seeking, even if this legislation passes, to be able to affect positive change in the months ahead. I'm going to start by talking about the one issue that probably takes all of the air out of the room whenever we talk about Bill 148, and that is the minimum wage change. And so when this legislation began, the minimum wage was at $11.40. There was the annual regular increase in the minimum wage, which was roughly the rate of inflation, which brought it up to $11.60 as of October 1st. So right now in the province, the minimum wage, general minimum wage, is $11.60. On January 1st, 2018, that will go up to $14. And on January 1st, 2019, that will go up to $15. And so in conducting conversations around this legislation, I think it's true that a lot of us understand and have a tremendous amount of compassion for those who would work full-time and still not be able to provide for their family. I think the Premier makes a compelling argument around how in a province as prosperous as Ontario, we need to do more to ensure that that prosperity is shared. However, the amount of cost increases that businesses will have to incur as part of Bill 148 is likely going to bring with it a tremendous amount of unintended consequences. So how significant of a change is $15 an hour, or 32% increase in now only 14 months? Well, the Premier likes to talk about other jurisdictions where they have increased the minimum wage to $15 an hour. In California, it took 5 years to get there. In Seattle, it took 4 years to get there. In Ontario, we're now going to increase it by 32% in now 14 months. That's a staggering change. And what we're most concerned about is that it was only 3 years ago in which this government adjusted the process by which we calculate minimum wage. And the Premier decided at the time, after conducting a panel, to increase the minimum wage by roughly the rate of inflation, announce that change every spring, and conduct that change every fall. It satisfied the business community that wanted more predictable increases. It satisfied social justice groups that wanted individuals that relied upon a minimum wage to know that they could get an annual increase. And the whole intent was to safeguard against arbitrary political decision-making. And now here we are in the life of this very government, and this is what we're encountering, an arbitrary political decision. And from our perspective, it goes against the very heart of the approach that this very Premier had adopted only 3 years ago. One more thing. In conducting the advisory panel, which provided a recommendation to the Premier in 2014, the members of that panel looked at examples of minimum wage increases across Canada and concluded that when looking at Canadian examples, for every 10% you raise the minimum wage, youth employment goes down by 6%. And so this is where we begin to become concerned about the unintended consequences of proceeding, notwithstanding the intent of the legislation, which may be noble and good, to impose this much change and this many new costs on businesses in such a short period of time will no doubt have unintended consequences. But Bill 148 has much broader changes than just the minimum wage change. And in fact, it will provide a number of reforms to both the Labor Relations Act and the Employment Standards Act. Those two pieces of legislation guide the relationship between every employee and employer in the province. I'm going to spend a moment focused on the changes to the Labor Relations Act. And as I say, I think there's something like 174 changes that will come as a result of Bill 148, and we'll have time today only to focus on a very few, which goes to the point of needing to spend time to educate yourself and perhaps consult professional advice. But let's take a look at some of the biggest changes to the Labor Relations Act. So Bill 148 brings about something called card-based certification for the sectors, the temporary help agencies, the building services sector, and home care and community services sector. What is card-based certification? So many of us are familiar with the process by which union certification unfolds in the province, whereby there is a union drive, and if an employee group is successful in a secret ballot vote of achieving more than 50%, then that workplace will be certified. And there's more nuances to it than that, but that's the basis of it. Card-based certification changes that process for the sectors that are laid out in legislation. And what that means is that if an employee group is able to have 55% of employees within that workplace sign a card to indicate their desire to form a union, then that workplace will automatically certify without the need for a secret ballot vote. Now, I think all of us in Canada would defend and protect the rights of anyone to form a labor union within their organization. That's a basic fundamental right. But I think consistent with that right is the basic democratic value of being able to make one's choice known and decided without the opportunity for coercion, to have it protected by a secret ballot voting process. Card-based certification takes away that right. And you can see how this would unfold. You'll have a number of employees who are very intent on forming a union within their workplace, and they will potentially make their colleagues feel like scabs even before that workplace certifies. And so we're very concerned, frankly, from the employee's perspective, but that this process will also unnaturally cause a proliferation of union certification in this province. And we are very concerned with that. What's more, Bill 148 actually lays out the ability of the government of the day to extend card check certification beyond these sectors without the need for the passage of legislation, so that change could come as a result of a regulation being passed by cabinet. So although your workplace may not be captured in the temporary help agency, building services sector, or home care and community services sector, the government of the day could extend card check certification to any sector without having to change legislation. That's a fundamental change. Another component of the Labor Relations Act that I'll focus on is the call for lowering the threshold by which a workplace would have to provide comprehensive, sensitive employee data to an employee group. So presently, if an employee group can demonstrate that 40% of their colleagues are interested in forming a union, then the employer is compelled to provide comprehensive contact lists to that employee group. With Bill 148, that threshold will be lowered to 20%. So we believe that threshold is too low, and in fact, we're already hearing from labor lawyers that threshold is too low, it violates privacy concerns, and will almost certainly be litigated against. Now on to some of the other employment standards changes that will come as a result of Bill 148. So equal pay for equal work provisions the intent is to protect individuals who are not full-time permanent, but perhaps who do the same work as a full-time permanent employee. So what equal pay for equal work will do is compel those individuals who are perhaps working part-time or who are working on contract, they will now have to be paid and compensated the same as a full-time permanent employee. In our view, what this does is it further restricts the ability of the employer to determine the value that they would provide, that they would see within their employees. And of course, I think all of us realize that our salary and our compensation is commensurate with the value that we bring into our organization. Equal pay for equal work further restricts the ability of the employer to make the decision for themselves as to what the value of that employee is. To hear the government describe it, sometimes you would think that they were addressing the gender wage gap issue, when in fact it has nothing to do with that, and that is already illegal in the province. Equal pay for equal work would also make it difficult if you were to hire two people at generally the same time. You'll have an onus of more paperwork if down the road you would want to pay one more than the other. And so in many ways it does provide a tremendous amount of new paperwork in how you would conduct your workplace and how you would choose to compensate people. Personal emergency leave will also see significant changes. So presently in Ontario, if you have a workplace of less than 50 employees, you do not need to extend personal emergency leave days to those employees. If you have more than 50 employees, you do have to extend 10 personal emergency leave days. That will now change. So the thinking before had been if you have a small workplace, it becomes more challenging to compensate for individuals who may or may not be present. However, with Bill 148, you will now have to extend 10 personal emergency leave days to all employees. And what's more, 2 of those days will be paid. So across Canada, there is no other province that has paid personal emergency leave days, with the exception of Prince Edward Island, and it's 1 day, and it's if you've been working with a workplace for 5 years. Now in the province of Ontario, all employees will have 2 paid personal emergency leave days. They are the first 2 days that an employee would take. And remember, personal emergency leave is not prorated. So you could hire a student for the summer, have them for 2 or 3 months. That student could decide to take the last 2 weeks off. You'd have to pay them for 2 of those days. And another change that Bill 148 brings about is that you can no longer ask for a doctor's note. So I could take the next 2 weeks off, and my employer would have no recourse to ask for a doctor's note of me. Following the 2 weeks, though, the employer still does have the provision to request a doctor's note. Scheduling change will also be significant. One thing that I'll focus on here is that many industries and sectors in this province depend upon on-call employees. Bill 148 will make a dramatic change in that if you cancel a shift for any employee, including an on-call employee, within 48 hours, you must pay them for 3 hours of work. This is especially challenging. I know many industries build their business model around the ability to scale up or scale down very quickly. Now employers will have to err on the side of potentially not bringing those employees in. This will mean reduced hours for many employees. This is actually one area where the Chamber was successful in changing this legislation. The original iteration of the legislation did not protect against potentially canceling shifts for the purpose of weather. Following our advocacy, the government is allowing for the canceling of shifts as it relates to weather or God acts beyond your control. But for anything else, you would have to pay an employee for 3 hours worth of work. Paid vacation, we've heard, will increase to 3 weeks for an employee after 5 years. I was hearing from a labor lawyer last night. This includes if an employee goes away from your workplace and comes back. If the total is 5 years, you would have to extend a 3rd week of vacation. Public holiday pay, the way in which that is calculated will be changed. It is now so convoluted that even after giving a presentation 40 times and hearing it from 40 labor lawyers, I still can't explain it. So perhaps our colleagues at MMP can do a better job than me. The enforcement officers, with the hiring of 175 more enforcement officers, the province is roughly doubling the amount of enforcement officers that they'll have. So all this to say, you will have an obligation to become very familiar with the changes that are coming about, because you are twice as likely as before to be reviewed for compliance. So very quickly, I want to take some time to review an economic analysis that was conducted by the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and working cooperatively with the Keep Ontario Working Coalition, which is a broad coalition of industry and sector associations. When the government came out with the legislation, the very first thing that we said to the government was, we understand your desire to protect people, to support the most vulnerable in our society, but you have an onus and an obligation, government, to ensure that you are proceeding with evidence-based reform. And the government declined the opportunity to conduct an economic analysis. And so at the Chamber of Commerce and other industry and sector associations, we pooled our resources to employ an economics firm that in fact works with the Government of Ontario in 4 ministries, CANCEA, the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time showing you what they found. So CANCEA looked at the numbers, and they looked at some of the most costly items as part of Bill 148. And the numbers that you see before you are total costs for businesses in the province over the next 2 years alone. And so we find that the minimum wage increase will result in $13 billion in new costs for businesses. And this is actually a very conservative estimate because we've based it on those who are currently making minimum wage and provided an average increase of about $2. So we're taking into account that that most people would be making somewhere north of the $13 mark, when of course that might not be true. And we also don't take into account all of those who might be making $14 or $15 an hour presently, and due to compression, will be seeking an increase in their pay. And so by all estimates, $13 billion is a very conservative estimate about what the 2-year impact will be for businesses. And you can see there some of the other costly provisions that will come as a result of Bill 148. And they will total over 2 years $23 billion in new costs for businesses. So this is a staggering amount of money. And of course, faced with these costs, businesses are going to have to confront them in very serious ways. And so the next thing that the economists did was they said, okay, faced with this new cost burden, how will businesses deal with this? And they looked at the leading academic work that's coming out of the University of Toronto, Queen's, and McMaster, taking a look at Canadian examples of how businesses adjust to cost increases. And they determined the following. Businesses will bear about 50% of the costs through their employees. And what that means is that half of the $23 billion will be dealt with by firing people, not hiring people that they would have otherwise hired, cutting hours, or fast-pacing people to retirement. So about half of the cost will be dealt with through the employees. 29% of the cost will be dealt with by increasing the cost of everyday goods and services. And 21% of the cost will be dealt with by simply absorbing it. So that's 21% of the $23 billion that will just cut into your bottom line. So when we came out with this analysis, the government said, now hold on. When you pay people more, they spend more. And no doubt Bill 148 will have a stimulatory impact on the economy. Well, the truth is that the first piece of this, the impact on employees, will not have a stimulatory effect, and neither will increasing the cost of everyday goods and services. However, cutting into business margins and effectively transferring that profit from the employer to the employee, that will have a stimulatory effect on the economy. And the economists estimate that over 2 years, it will have an $11 billion stimulatory effect on the economy. So what we look at when we analyze this from an advocacy perspective is that we still have a $12 billion problem that this government needs to solve. And our message to them is that they need to solve it through some form of slowing down the legislation, through some form of tax offset, or through some form of just removing components of the legislation because it is too much, too fast. The impact. The impact of these changes, our economists estimate, is a 50% increase to inflation this year and for the foreseeable future, which we believe will result in up to $1,300 in new costs for the average family in this province, and will result in 185,000 jobs to be at risk. That's a combination of people that will be let go and jobs that would have existed that otherwise will not exist. And so, what I would leave you with before we conclude is the following. The intent of this legislation is certainly noble, and this government has in front of them a desire to protect the most vulnerable people in our society. But as I've gone to 40 communities across the province, I've heard from charities who have said to us, in an environment where corporate profits are dropping, so too will corporate giving. I've heard from those who run daycares who say that they're going to have to increase the cost of daycares, a service that is already out of reach for so many families in this province. We've heard from those who run retirement homes who will have to increase the cost of retirement homes. This government is making retirement security a priority. And I've given you the example of how this will impact young people looking for work. So for all of these reasons, we at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and those partners in the Keep Ontario Working Coalition have said, it is because we are compassionate toward the most vulnerable people in our society that we are opposed to Bill 148. And so I would encourage you to go to keepontarioworking.ca. There's a template letter there where you can contact your MPP and the leaders of the provincial parties and to send a message to them that the unintended consequences of Bill 148 are dramatic. They will harm economic development in this province, and more must be done to change Bill 148 before it is adopted into law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Carl. Very informative, updated. We appreciate all of the work that the Chamber of Commerce has been doing, and as you said, will continue to do up to and including 4 o'clock today at the legislature. It's Al Lambert back with you. We're going to switch gears a little bit from the insight that Carl has brought to you. Carl mentioned that our relationship with the Chamber of Commerce is significant and long-standing. When we had a conversation several months ago, we brought the perspective that certainly the changes that are pending are significant. There certainly had been much attention paid to the minimum wage, but we urged together to say that certainly the impacts, as Carl has just explained, are far-reaching. They're far-reaching not only for those of you in a situation of a labor relations environment, far-reaching in terms of those of you across different industries and sectors with different terms and conditions of employment, different compensation structures, different leaves provisions, etc. So we took some time to sort of think about not only the impacts, as Carl has just explained, but to think about how best to provide some advice to businesses like yourselves in terms of not only understanding, but planning in a thoughtful way, and importantly, and this is where we believe you're at now, taking action from an employer perspective. So for the next few minutes, I will talk through some HR strategies that we've put together that we hope all of you, and understanding that on the line we have small, medium, and large businesses with us, will take to heart, whether you have HR support within your organization, or whether as an owned proprietorship business, you are the HR advisor. We urge you to think about the following as we go forward. So first off, again, thanks to our Chamber of Commerce colleagues, we were able to together put together a handbook called Steering Through Change. What I'm going to talk to you today is a few ideas in there, but we urge you, if you haven't, to have a read, think about it as a tool and as a support to you as you plan and take action. So I'm going to talk a little bit about preparation and some HR strategies, and then I'm going to turn it over to Johan Tomi to talk about some operational strategies, which, as Carl just mentioned to all of you, are important considerations that, just as HR considerations, you must take into account. In terms of where we would suggest you go from here, number one is assessing the impact. As we talked about the wage increase and the amount of the prospect that in just over 2 months, your wages may very well, for those earning under $14, increase by 23% max. That, from a compensation perspective, is staggering as a one-shot increase. So in terms of understanding and assessing the impact, based on all of the changes that are anticipated, whether it be to scheduling, leaves, paid vacation, etc., make sure that you've got a good understanding of what applies. For those of you, again, in those organizations that may already be in a collective agreement environment, or those that may be pending, the changes particular to the Labor Relations Act may have significant implications. Overall, and again, turning back to Carl's broad review of the overall financial impact, you as employers must understand the financial impact to your organization. Then, with that in mind, and we would always advocate good HR planning and having an HR plan to think about the actions that are going to be required. And number one is to make sure that across terms and conditions of employment, wages, etc., that you are in compliance. The fact that, as Carl just mentioned, there will be an additional 175 Employment Standards Act officers is significant. But number one, in terms of doing business in Ontario, is making sure that you are prepared for compliance. Second, and this is really where Johan will talk a little bit about, is how to best, because some of these numbers are staggering, how to best minimize the impact to your organization. The sort of three scenarios that we spoke about in terms of kind of taking the wages and being able to, as an organization, work through versus other impacts on existing or prospective workforces are going to be significant. And so our sort of first message to you is around preparation and understanding. Just as we felt it was important to have an ability to communicate broadly with employers such as yourself across Ontario, so too do we believe that you must consider what we would frame as a communication plan for your organization to facilitate an understanding of the impacts, to facilitate an understanding with supervisors and managers in terms of the impacts, and then to prepare once Royal Assent and the provisions come into play, to prepare to communicate to employees. As we talk in the next few minutes, part of the review you're going to have to do is around your policies, compensation plans, etc. Those must be communicated both with supervisors, management, and your leadership group, and then of course employees. So the sort of number one on the action plan is how both an understanding and an impact and implications will be communicated in a cascading way across your organization. The next and probably most significant from a work perspective in preparation is to think about the very infrastructure that exists or doesn't exist within your organization. We know some organizations have very detailed HR policies, and when we talk about documentation, we're talking about rules and practices and protocols for employees to deploy in the event of asking for a leave, requesting a schedule change, etc. So number one, and back to both compliance, but also to make sure that there is a smooth transition across the elements of change, is to make sure that all of your sort of terms and conditions are checked, routines and expectations are checked, and this to go back to a couple of the areas, and most notably the sort of equal pay for equal work provision. In many cases, we know organizations have, in some cases, very detailed descriptions of work, whether they be a job description, etc. Those are going to have to, in many cases, be refreshed to make sure that the documentation is current and reflects what people are doing, and that's a preparatory activity in the event, as we've learned in the legislation, an employee can sort of point to another employee or role and say, that's also what I do, so I should be paid the same. So in terms of sort of policies and documentation, we think that across all the elements of the workplace and workforce, it's important to just sort of do a check. In cases where documentation doesn't exist, it's probably a good time to write some things down and put in place some routines to be prepared. In terms of routines, it could be anything from who an employee must notify in the event of a request for leave, a request for clarification, etc. That in and of itself can save what can often be very, very cumbersome processes within an organization. So in addition to the sort of hardcore policies and documentation that exists, make sure the routines are also clarified. This too, in terms of job offer letters, contracts of employment, etc., and any documents that employees would receive at the point of onboarding, could be an orientation, could be a booklet, etc. Those also need to be checked and updated to reflect what January 1st may be the new world. Just a bit of a color commentary at this point. The other thing that's incredibly important is to make sure that the timing and sequencing of the changes coming into effect is well known. And if you go on the headlines of the paper of for example, of the move to a $15 minimum wage, many will think that's happening January 1st. And so I think it's really, really important to make sure that you as employers understand the sequencing of activities and the sequencing upon which many of these provisions will come into play. The other, and again, we know in our audience today we have small, medium, large businesses. In many cases, there will be some sort of an HRIS or record-keeping software. It's going to be really, really important to make sure that that's accurate. Whether employees kind of self-serve and record their absences or requests, that's going to be really, really important to track and make sure, again, from a compliance perspective, those are up to date. If I'm an employment standards policy officer and coming to a workplace, that might be the first place I check, is show me your HRIS or show me your documentation that shows that you're in compliance and have communicated to employees. Probably one of the most unheralded parts of HR is always the sort of compensation structure, whether it be some sort of a job evaluation approach that you have to relatively compare roles. This new change in wages is a game changer from a compensation perspective. Carl mentioned compression and the potential of compression with some roles now being compressed with others. The other reality that I would suggest to you is what I would call inversion, and the possibility of roles that may in fact have a lesser weight in the organization, so to speak, actually inverted from a pay perspective when we're talking about such substantive changes of 23% and 32%. So in all cases, again, it's never a bad time to if you're a small business, kind of looking at the relative wages of your employees, or a medium or large business looking at the very job evaluation and compensation program that you have in place. I think the potential of compression and inversion is significant, and I think the market shift that we are witnessing or will likely witness as of January 1st must absolutely be considered. In terms of record keeping, I've talked a little bit about that so far. Just whether it's paper records, whether you've got an HRIS or keeping records somewhere on a PC, making sure that the new requirements in terms of all provisions, whether they be pay, leaves, etc., are well understood and documented. And making sure that in terms of collecting and storing information for the future, it's you've got a way forward. I think that at the end of the day, knowing that these are compliance-based changes, always, and as many of you who may have been visited by an Employment Standards Act officer before would know, they're going to be looking for documentation that these provisions have been properly weaved into your HR systems and are well in place in the organization. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Johan Tomi. I hope I haven't scared all of you. I think if that was going to happen, I think that was Carl. But I thought we did want to make sure that all of you are in a state of preparedness, a state of action, and ready to be in compliance and have a plan as of January 1st. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Johan to talk about operational strategies. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you very much, Alan and Carl. My colleagues know I'm the most verbose, so they slotted me right at the end here. I don't even get a slide with my picture on it, but I think I come up right at the end, so thank you. So we're about 10 minutes to our close to Q&A, and I'm going to pivot this presentation a little bit. I'm going to talk about some pragmatic things that you can do to react to some of these changes. As Carl said, the final reading is today. We are expecting a lot of these changes to pass, and so I want to start talking about what a lot of the folks on the call here can do for their businesses. So operational strategies to mitigate impacts. Well, really 5 that I want to outline here today. The first is sales, and there are going to be cost increases in your business. There's going to be increased overhead that you will need to start investing in as a result of some of the HR changes and HR administrative complexities. And sales covers a multitude of problems and business challenges. I think more companies that were pretty stagnant in their sales are going to have to think about new ways to grow to cover some of these increased costs. Some of the other items here are around workforce planning. I'm going to get into that. Increased automation, improved business processes, and improving margins. I have a friend, a dear friend of mine, that runs a company. It's about $1 million in revenue, and he was quite concerned about Bill 148. And some of the things that he started to do about 4 or 5 months ago was looking at growing his company. It was also looking at improving his margins, understanding that he couldn't necessarily pass on the costs to his consumers. He looked at getting into product lines that would generate greater margins. So just being proactive and thinking about things like that are really helpful. I know over the last 4 or 5 months, we haven't just had Bill 148 that's hit the business community. We've also had changes in the private corporation tax, which also caused some pressure. So both these things are just going to have to put some onus now on the business owner, especially in the small to medium-sized space, to start thinking about how they're going to run their business differently. Next slide, please. So sales growth. One of the key impacts here is going to be that your overhead is going to increase. You're going to have to invest in more redundancy in your business, specifically because of more room now for the employee to take more sick time, to take more time off, and you as a business owner, especially when you have one person in one seat or 2 people in servicing a particular department, you're going to have to think about now risk in your business, increased cost. Well, your costs are going to increase. I think we can all sit down and agree to that fact. It's going to increase anywhere from under 32%, which is the impact of the minimum wage increase. But even in clients of mine that don't necessarily pay their employees minimum wage, you are going to see some level of wage inflation, depending on the industry you're in, depending on what you pay your people. So increased redundancy in your business is going to have to cost more. You need to start thinking about growing your sales. That's going to cover ultimately a multitude of challenges in your business with this increased cost structure. So I've begun to talk to clients about not necessarily just doing more with your sales staff or growing your sales, but how do we grow your sales? How do we grow your margins? And how do we grow the right product lines in your business so that you are making more money. Next slide, please. So, really want to get into sort of talking specifically about the increased labor costs. Well, Canada as a nation, we have one of the lowest investment spends on employee training in the G10, and that's interesting because a lot of my clients, a lot of people in the business community are worried about the increased costs in employee wages. Well, I usually go back to them and say, think about it this way: if you're paying someone more money, as long as they're delivering more value, then those two balance each other out. So think about things that you can do in your business to better workforce plan, to better increase the skill sets of the employees that you have working in your company, because the pay increase could be netted out with a skills improvement. And I'm going to touch on an example a few slides down in my package on how one of our clients at M&P has done that. Next slide, please. So labor productivity improvement, regardless of the industry that you're at, you're going to see a cost increase. And so in working with our clients, we typically see anywhere from about 10 to about 20% of labor productivity improvement in their business. So, if you are a private sector corporation, and I would say regardless, my statistic is sort of regardless of industry, you have about 10 to 20% at least opportunity to improve your productivity in your business. And so you're not going to get it back by making your people work faster. This is mainly going to come from being more effective. A lot of people are focusing, the word efficiency is getting thrown out a lot these days. Specifically, people are talking about, well, I'm just going to have to get more efficient. My people are going to have to get more efficient. Well, it's not necessarily going to come from more efficiency. It's going to come from greater effectiveness in your business. And I would define effectiveness as doing the right things, and I would define efficiency as doing things well. So we need to be doing more of the right things in our business and be focused on doing those things. So, look at the way you schedule your labor. Look at the way you serve your customers. This is an opportunity to rethink your business process, to rethink the way you do things, because most processes evolve as you grow. So if you're running the same process that you ran when you were half the size, well, there's opportunity there, not just to cut costs, but also to serve your customers better. So this should be an impetus to help you do that. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk through an example now of a company here that did really well to mitigate some of the risks of Bill 148. They saw it coming down the pipeline. They are a $60 million medical device company. They are mainly involved in the contract manufacturing space, and they anticipated growth of about 10%. They had a lot of their own proprietary products, and a lot of the patents on them were expiring, and so they knew they were going to face not just pressure on their margins with more generic producers coming into the marketplace, but they also knew that with the increased cost from Bill 148, they had to do something. And as they looked at their business model, they were scratching their head to say, do we still have a value proposition, and do we still have a business model here? So one of the things that they invested in tremendously was they looked at their business process. They looked at their labor productivity. They thought about the way they scheduled labor. They thought of the way they managed their customers, and they managed the schedule and managed the demand. And what they were actually able to do is they came out with a way to shorten their lead times. They came out with a way to reduce the labor costs as a percentage of their total sales. And they were able to come up with a way to better scale the company. In that time, it's interesting, it was the perfect storm, because their product mix shifted from a product that was fairly capital intensive in nature to labor intensive in nature. So they ended up needing to hire 250 employees to 600 employees. So think about think about this: if you're this company, or you know someone that's this company, where you've had to hire 400 more employees in the span of about a year, with about a 20 to 30% cost increase. So I'm going to pass it on over to Alan now. That will close us off. And thank you very much.
So in terms of next steps, folks, we very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. Thank you, Johan. Thank you, Carl. The great news is that we've had a number of questions come in, and we do have a few minutes to work through some of the questions. I'll go through a few that we have, and as others come in, we'll continue to do our best to at least provide a little bit of perspective as at today. I think the main sort of point that Carl made and that we'll reaffirm is that we still don't know exactly what the final bill will be. We've got a pretty good indication. We do know that there were changes from first reading through second, and we do anticipate there will be more. So just a little bit of a disclaimer that again, what we know now is potentially subject to change. So I'm going to lead in with the first question, and I think Johan, see if you can have an answer to this. We have, are there any businesses that this change will affect positively?
Thank you, Alan, for that question. Yes, I would put it in four categories. The first one would be if you are the largest player in your industry, you naturally had to invest in a certain amount of redundancy and risk mitigation. You had to probably carry a few more extra staff and better business systems. Well, you're now going to be in a better place because your competitors that are smaller are going to have to invest in the same infrastructure, and it's going to significantly impact their cost base. So, if you're a larger company, you're not going to be better off. You're not going to make more money, but your competitors are basically going to make less. So it's going to make you more competitive in the marketplace. So that's one, large company. Number two, if you're a consolidator, and if generally there's a lot of consolidation happening in your industry and you're the one doing it, this is a huge opportunity for you because it's going to be an impetus to really force a bunch of smaller companies that now can't compete and can't adapt to the new business model. It's interesting. This actually makes the situation less fair and less competitive. I think in a lot of industries, especially in industries that are heavily labor intensive. The third one is automation companies. So if you're a company that's into automation right now, well, this is the gold pot at the end of the rainbow. A lot of companies are going to look at strategies towards mitigating, towards implementing more automation in their company. Lastly, professional services companies. So if you're a lawyer, if you're an architect, if you're a lawyer, if you're an accountant, if you are a consulting firm, I think business is going to be good, and it's going to be good because there's going to be a lot more complexity. And I like what Carl said earlier. He's attended a bunch of these sessions, and the complexity to some of these rules is astounding. And you're going to need a professional to help you walk through it. So, if you're in professional services of any kind, you are going to do well. I hope that answers it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Johan. I'm gonna jump in and tackle one myself actually, and that is there was a question around the clarification of so-called paid vacation. If the employee is hourly and not full-time hours, is the employee only entitled to the 4% vacation or also paid vacation time? The provision as it exists in the proposed bill is actually not necessarily an extension to the way vacation time is paid out, whether it be time taken or 4% vacation pay. What the proposal is that you actually would have a gradient of paid vacation, and that would be for those from sort of 0 to 5 years. It would essentially be status quo with 2 weeks at 4%. The proposal is that with those employees with greater than 5 years tenure, it would actually increase to 3 weeks at 6%. So it's not necessarily a change of how employers process or administer a vacation, but it's a gradient that's been introduced relative to paid vacation time. I'm hoping that helps in terms of that question. Another question that came in, Johan, if you can think about this one, what types of companies will be affected, and are any industries exempt?
I don't believe there are any industries that are exempt, but if I'm wrong, please correct me, Al. I think what types of companies are affected the most, what industries. I'm going to pivot that question a little bit and say that it's going to affect all industries. It's going to affect specific segments of the marketplace more than others. And so if you're a small to medium-sized enterprise and specifically have less than 50 employees, the administrative cost burden on you right now has just increased. And so, if you were running Excel to manage your human resources, well, you're going to have to upgrade, to something a little bit more robust. And so that's going to add costs in your business. The rules for companies that are under 50 employees have changed the most. Larger companies have typically always had at least most of these rules in place as it relates to HR administrative policies. So if you are under 50 employees, you are going to be adversely affected, and you need to start thinking about how are you going to find opportunities to mitigate against these cost increases, and not just the cost increases, but also you will need to build more operational infrastructure in your business to handle these new administrative requirements. Al, anything to add there?
No, Johan, I think we're good. If you want to close off the webinar, we want to be respectful of folks' time, and we're just about at 10:30.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you again, all the speakers. Carl, it was great to have you, and Alan, and all of you on the webinar that took the time to join us this morning. I know I saw a lot of questions come through. We're going to be responding to them and sending them out to you. So should you have any other questions and had time to think about the materials presented, please do reach out to myself, Alan, or Carl. You will be getting a recording of this webinar sent to you, and so you will have our contact information. And thank you once again for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you. This is the end of the webinar. Have a great day.